Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the raid guide for Normal and Heroic Iron Maidens. One of the last bosses you'll probably defeat before moving on to Blackhand himself. This encounter is quite difficult. There are a lot of mechanics going on, a number of various phase transitions, areas to fight the battle, splitting your raid off, all that good stuff. So let's just start going through everything. Just to cover all bases, as usual, I'll start with raid composition, but as always, Normal and Heroic really doesn't matter too much. You want 2 tanks, a reasonable number of healers. The healing requirement on this fight is not all that high, so except for perhaps the very end of the fight, when you'll probably be using cooldowns anyway, there really isn't a lot of healing to do. It's mostly a matter of players handling the mechanics as they're expected to. So probably a standard of 1 healer for 5 people would be fine. And then a mix of DPS. Melee are probably slightly at an advantage in this fight. There's a lot of cleave, but you do need enough range to handle the mechanics that only target ranged and to kill some of the targets in the later part of the fight. So for tanking this fight, 1 tank will generally be on Enforcer Sorka, the other tank will be on Marak the Blooded, and Admiral Goron is a non-tanked mob. He can be moved somewhat, if you taunt him and whatnot, but he doesn't require a tank and he won't actually attack the tank. Primarily, he just, kind of one of those range mobs that does his own thing. Now, the general positions you want to use are going to be some position kind of centered between 2 walls, right and left. So you can see the central position for all the mobs is dead center, kind of along the stairs where they spawn. You also want to have some rough positions for a few key abilities. We'll talk about the details of those later. But you can see there's 3 raid markers. The central one in the middle of the room for ranged is the red marker. There's also a green marker for rough tank position, and then a purple marker behind that tank position. You'll also notice we have a Warlock portal going there, and those things will be handy later on when you're dealing with the blood ritual ability, penetrating shot, all that good stuff. And we'll talk about the details of those in a bit. But that's the overall positioning. You cannot really afford to tank the bosses in the center and with everyone spread around them because of the difficulty of managing those focused abilities that I just mentioned. And so this is why you want to tank them sort of off to the side, but centered with markers indicating those spots. Now, one of the core concepts to this fight is the Dreadnaught ship. This ship will be boarded by one of the 3 main bosses at various intervals during the fight. The boss that goes up there is going to be generally based on the health or if it is boarded previously. So you can see the intervals there. The first is at 1 minute in, and this boss that will board at this first time is simply the boss with the lowest health. The second time at 4 minutes 20, it's the lowest health boss that has not boarded previously. So the bosses cannot repeat. They cannot board more than 1 time. And then the last time, of course, is just the last boss, the one that has not boarded up to that point. Now, during these boarding phases, the bosses will summon sort of the mini-boss up on top of the deck of the ship. And there will be 6 large hooks at the edge of this platform that the raid is on that will allow up to 6 raid members to swing over there and engage and kill that mini-boss. If you fail to do so, you'll eventually wipe the raid. You have a certain amount of time to do it. In addition to that, the remaining platform here, while the 1 boss is missing, will be bombarded with a pattern of bombs. And these bombs, they're not static patterns essentially, but they kind of go in yin and yang segments. So there's always a safe place to be to avoid the bombs every single time. And it's not that difficult to avoid them. You just have to get used to how it works a little bit. So we'll talk about the mini bosses in a second, but first let's go over the bombardment and how that works. Now notice that these bombs from boss mods are generally called pattern alpha and pattern omega. And that's essentially because alpha is a small number of bombs, the initial of the pair or the set, and omega is sort of the large number of bombs that fill in the gaps. Now, in either case, the initial bomb strikes have a red ring, and just a few seconds after that ring appears, the bomb will actually land. If you're in that ring, you'll get hit by a small blast and knocked away. But the more important thing to avoid is the actual explosion. So after a bomb has been thrown down, it has sort of an activation time. And during that period, you can freely move over it. It will slowly activate and become red just before it explodes. And of course, the explosion is the main thing you want to avoid. So the first thing to understand about the bombs is that they essentially have 3 states that they pass through over time. So at first, a bomb will be marked where it's going to land with a large red circle, as you see here. After that initial hit happens, it will do damage to anyone that's there, knock them back, and then it will be converted into just a stationary bomb that is not about to explode there. So there you can see that just the gray circle is just our bomb that has landed there. And then the final of the third state is this bomb will be red and it's going to explode. And of course, when it explodes, it does big damage to anyone that's there. So of these 3 states, each bomb will pass through them in order every time. In addition to this, the bombs having 3 states, you have 2 different patterns or sets of bombs, the alpha and the omega. So in total, there are 6 states that will occur during the bombardments, but at any given time, each of the 2 different patterns of bombs will be activating 2 different states. So you need to use this knowledge to then go from positions of the alpha to the omega, back to the alpha, back to the omega, and kind of repeat this process. Now the actual pattern that you'll see bombs in and how you dodge them is pretty simple. You'll initially get a small number of alpha bombs. So we'll just, in our part of the room that we're examining, here's just one alpha bomb that's going to land there. There's the red circle. And meanwhile, maybe you're off to the right slightly. So you want to be fairly close to where an alpha is landing for your pattern that you're going to do. Shortly after the first state, so after the bomb lands, you'll then see the bomb in that position. Explosion has gone off. So there's the alpha bomb, just to the left. Meanwhile, you will have a number of the omega bombs coming out, and this is the big number of bombs in this set, this bombardment. So you'll probably have one here, and here, and here, and let's just imagine they're all around, and they continue out, So right now, the only safe position for you to not get hit by the initial landing explosion of all of these omega bombs is on top of the alpha bomb, which is a safe position because the initial hit already landed, so it's in its second state. So you want to move to the left here. So let's just do that. Actually, I have to drag that. There we go. All right, so now you are basically hanging out with this alpha bomb while the initial hits happen with all the omegas. And then, of course, the actual omega bombs will land and the explosions will go off. And then the actual alpha bomb that you're on will start to explode. It will turn red. So then at this point, you need to move back to where you started, back toward now on top of an omega bomb somewhere. So we'll just go back to this right one where we started. And then the final step, of course, is the alpha bomb will explode. It will be gone completely. Your final move will be back here as all of the omega bombs are now exploding. And then they will all explode. And then the process will repeat. So then at some point you'll see 1 or 2 circles to indicate the initial alphas, and the whole thing just goes over once again. Now, meanwhile, when one of the bosses goes onto the Dreadnought, you have to send a team of 6 players on the hooks to go up there and do the little miniature boss battle. So the first one we'll talk about is Sorka. This is one of the 2 Dreadnought events that requires a tank. So you need a tank, a healer, and 4 DPS. And I have to apologize for the footage here. I was just running around. I really had no idea what I was doing. This was one of the first attempts on this boss that we made, because I don't have any other footage of this particular phase. But anyway, you can see the basic idea here is you get a bunch of small eviscerator adds throughout the phase. These will fixate on random people up top, and they will apply a stacking debuff that increases physical damage taken. They have very low health, however, and meanwhile you have a mini-boss that needs to be tanked. So the basic idea is if you have a fixated mob on you, run it into the melee range so that the DPS can cleave it down and kill it off very quickly. Other than that, you obviously need to just kill the mini-boss. The actual end of the phase, so to speak, when the ship people can leave, is based on killing the mini-boss. So technically you don't have to kill the eviscerators, but if you leave them alive too long or with too many of them active, someone will probably die and take too much damage. So that's the basic idea of the Sorka boat phase. And when it's over, you go to the end and click on one of the bombs that's kind of rotating around. I don't have footage of that until later on, but you'll see it in a minute. And you'll be thrown off the boat and back to the main platform. Now for Admiral Goran's Dreadnought phase, you do not need a tank. This is the one time that you just need 1 healer and 5 DPS. So I would recommend having a standard team, essentially, which consists of 4 DPS plus 1 healer plus 1 tank. And then you have 1 substitute DPS. And that 1 substitute DPS comes up on this Admiral phase only. So you can see here you have 2 bosses. And again, you only have to kill one of the mini-bosses to transition. So in this case, the battle medic does not need to be killed, but he will frequently cast a heal around every 8 to 9 seconds, maybe 10 seconds, that needs to be interrupted. Otherwise, your DPS should be focusing on Uktar. Uktar has a sort of cleave shot attack, so it's best to have your members up here spread out. So you have 1 melee attacking from the front, 1 from the back, 1 from the side, or whatever. And meanwhile, you have other people spread around so that only 1 or 2 people are getting hit by his shots. You also want to make sure you interrupt the heal every time. So you need 2 people rotating interrupts on the battle healer. So make sure you plan your group accordingly. And then for Marak, the Blooded's Dreadnought phase, again, you need a tank, a healer, and 4 DPS. Range DPS will have a slightly easier time on this phase, but then that's counteracted by the Admiral Dreadnought phase being easier for melee due to interrupts. So it's tough to say. You could always do a different group for each of the boat phases in particular, but it's not really worth it. Anyway, you can see here the basic method is you have 1 mini-boss only, and he will very frequently spawn these blood pools underneath everyone that's up top. These pools have a short activation time, about 2 seconds, before they will start to do very heavy damage to anyone that's standing in them. What I found was, as a healer, I was basically able to get sort of 1 global, maybe 2, off before I had to move each time. Otherwise, you can see the basic idea is to just utilize the space around the boat. You have plenty of room to kill them in time, but you probably want to have your melee, for example, stand in front with the tank, and then just backpedal together, that kind of thing. And your range can kind of do their own thing. You don't have to really worry about it too much. And then just like before, once the boss dies, click on the bomb to launch yourself back to the main platform. And only 1 person needs to click on these bombs, by the way. So finally, we can talk about the actual bosses on the main platform and their core mechanics. So first of all, you have Iron Fury, which is the overall energy level of the bosses. They all share the same energy level. You cannot change the rate that they gain energy. It's just static over time. And this Iron Fury level determines the number of abilities that the bosses have active. So at the start, they each have 1 main ability that will be used. And then when they get 30 Iron Fury, they will get a second mechanic or ability. And finally, at 100 Iron Fury, they gain their last ability. So Once they're all at 100, there'll be 9 mechanics essentially going on at the same time. Now, in addition to that, when one of the bosses, any of the bosses really, is brought below 20% health, they will all automatically get up to 100 Iron Fury, and they will gain the Iron Will buff. This buff essentially increases their damage dealt by 10% every 20 seconds, and it stacks. So, this kind of ties into the overall strategy of the fight, in that you do not want to push any individual boss to below 20% before you're ready to start killing them. You want to kind of push them all below that 20% threshold at the same time, or close to it, because otherwise you'll have all of them gaining stacks of damage dealt from Iron Will far too long throughout the fight, and it will eventually kill you. So that's the overall goal. Keep them pretty even in health, with some minor adjustments as necessary for priorities, which we'll talk about later. And once they all actually hit that 100 energy mark, it'll be about the same time that they're starting to gain Fury, getting below 20%, or starting to gain Iron Will. And so then you start burning them down one at a time at that point. So in no particular order, we'll talk about Enforcer Sorka's abilities first. She starts off with Blade Dash throughout the entire fight, and she will dash between a series of random raid members, usually ranged, in quick succession. She will do moderate damage to these people and anyone within a few yards of them. So the basic way to deal with this is spread the raid out. Ranged players should be spread for most mechanics in this fight, and this is no exception. At 30 Fury, she gains Convulsive Shadows. This targets a random raid member with a 5-stack debuff that lasts for 10 seconds. Every time it ticks, every 2 seconds, it will deal heavy shadow damage to that player based on the number of stacks they have active, and then it will reduce the stack count by 1. The damage is highest the first tick and goes down linearly every tick. However, this debuff is also dispellable with magic dispels. The problem is that dispelling this deals instant damage based on the number of stacks remaining. And the way the math works out is that the only time that you actually save total damage dealt is if you dispel it instantly before it ticks, or before it ticks a second time. So basically, while it has 5 stacks or 4 stacks remaining, dispelling it at that point deals less total damage than if you just let it go. The problem is, this deals all that damage instantly. And if you dispel at a 5 stack, particularly if a player doesn't have a cooldown or is not full health, they'll probably die. And because you have to react so quickly to pull it off anyway, it's generally not going to be worth it. So bottom line is, the easiest way to deal with this ability is just heal that person quickly, start spamming them in heals, and for the first couple ticks at least. And then after the first few ticks, the damage keeps going down. You don't have to worry about healing them quite as much, and it'll be a lot easier to deal with the damage. Her final ability is Dark Hunt, and this is of course at 100 Fury. She will again target a random raid member, and this time they will get an 8-second debuff. After that expires, she will hunt them essentially, which does a massive damage hit on the player. But when I say massive, it's not actually that crazy. We typically saw hits of around a little under 200,000 damage on most people. And with health pools, for even this heroic difficulty, that's not that significant. Obviously, in addition to other things, it can kill you. So if the person gets it, they should use a personal cooldown when it's about to expire. But otherwise, it's not a massively big deal. Next, we have Admiral Goran, and his first base ability is Rapid Fire that I'll use throughout the fight. So I just have this one clip of this, unfortunately, but you can see that he will target a random raid member. It can be melee or ranged. And he will start to fire a series of volley shots at that player's location, but it's delayed. So you can see the circle as it chases you around. Handling this is very simple. You generally want to just quickly move away from the shot yourself and start dragging it in an empty space, usually around the outside wall or something like that. And once it's over, you can just watch his cast time. then you just go back to where you were. Now at 30 Fury, Admiral will gain Penetrating Shot, which is one of the more dangerous abilities in this encounter and requires the most effort to mitigate. This works exactly like the aim ability from Hissek the Stormkeeper in the Paragons of the Klaxi fight in Siege of Orgrimmar, if you're used to that. So basically the idea is it will target a random raid member, ranged player. That player will then have a few seconds before the actual shot goes off. There's a red line indicating who he's targeting. So there you can see it there. After the shot fires, it will deal very heavy damage to that player, but it will spread that damage, of course, to anyone that is in a straight line. So basically, you can mitigate the damage by having a bunch of people stack up within the shot line. The other thing you can do is to use a threat drop mechanic to stop it completely, and it won't continue. So you can feign death, invis, vanish, any of that sort of stuff will work. On that note, however, if you don't have the ability to do anything, your raid needs to help you mitigate it. And so the best way we've found to do it is to essentially have a ranged position. We're using the red marker in the center of the room, since it's most centralized. And that's where that player will go. And meanwhile, the rest of the raid will run over there to stack just slightly in front of them. And then this way, everyone soaks it up. Unlike the aim ability from Hissek and Paragons, you don't need to spread apart from one another. You can just be stacked up on top of each other as long as you're in the line in front of the player. The final ability that he gains is Dominator Turret at 100 Fury. This is one of the more dangerous abilities in the final phase, and will usually be the reason that you want to kill Admiral first. The basic idea is he will spawn a turret, as you see there on the left side, and this will just spin around and shoot these volleys of fire, and you just have to avoid them. But he will spawn them frequently enough that if you don't kill them off in this phase, they will start to overwhelm your raid pretty quickly, because he kind of charges to random locations, corners, or the center, and will spawn them over and over. So best thing to do is when you start getting these turrets, have your ranged DPS kill them off. Melee can't really afford to attack them, since they would have to run around them constantly to avoid getting hit by the fireballs that are spinning in all directions. Finally, we have Marak the Blooded, and his core ability that he starts with throughout the fight is the Blood Ritual. This will target a random raid member. It can be anyone except tanks. This player will have a blood beam going from the boss to their location. After a few seconds, when it expires, the Blood Ritual will go off, and it will do a cone attack from the boss's position toward the targeted player, and it will do pretty significant damage to anyone in the path. Perhaps more importantly, it will do very heavy damage to the first person that is hit by it. Because of this is the reasoning for the overall tanking position and the back markers. So I mentioned at the start, we have the tank position at green and the position behind the tanks at purple. So you want to have some position like this that is not facing anyone else in the raid, so it's off to one side or against a wall or something. And that is where those people afflicted with Blood Ritual go to stand before it expires. By standing behind the tank, but with no one else behind them, this ensures that the initial hit, the very large hit from Blood Ritual, hits the tank, or one of the tanks, and the secondary hit from the cone itself only hits that targeted player and no one else in the raid. So this mitigates the damage as much as possible. Another way you can technically handle this is to just eat the cone damage and have the tank sort of keep their back to the center of the group, so that the player that's afflicted with Blood Ritual would not have very far to run, since they'd always be running to the middle of the room rather than to, say, the front left or front right, respectively. The ability gained at 30 Fury is Blood-Soaked Heartseeker. This will target 3 random raid members. I believe it prefers ranged, but I cannot be certain on that one. Basically, after the debuff expires, it will deal damage to all 3 players, but this damage is reduced the further those players are from one another. So, theoretically, the best way to handle this is to have all 3 people run to corners that are not the same corner as one of the other people. And this would maximize the distance for the most part and mitigate the damage. Now, you don't really need to be that far away, but it's still a good idea when you get it to run to a wall somewhere. And I'll probably, for Mythic at least, have a weak aura that will sort of help guide people to know where they can run to get away from other people that are afflicted quickly. But for now, you just have to play it by ear and just start running against a wall or into a corner or something. Finally, at 100 Fury, she gains Sanguine Strikes, and this will deal pretty heavy damage to the tank, but more importantly, the damage it then deals to the rest of the raid is based on how much damage was mitigated by the tank. So it's almost identical to the Acid Torrent ability from Orgorger. Basic idea here is for the tank to use a personal cooldown or mitigation to reduce the damage they take and therefore the damage the raid takes. And this ability is probably the most dangerous of the final phase, because if Marak's stacks of Iron Will get too high and therefore his damage dealt increases too much, the damage that the tank and therefore the raid takes from this ability can be quite significant. So if you're having trouble in the final phase from this ability in particular, you may want to plan your kill order differently based on that. So the final thing to discuss is the overall boss priority and the transitions between, entering and exiting Dreadnaught phases, as well as pushing the bosses below 20% and starting that final Iron Fury phase. Now, one of the most difficult things we found when initially learning this fight was having to deal with penetrating shot from Admiral Goran at the same time that you were dodging bombardments on the main platform. The reason for this, of course, is that the raid members, the ranged, tend to be spread out, dodging bombardments, and when penetrating shot selected one of those players, it would be very difficult to often get enough people stacked with them to soak the damage. And the same goes for melee. They would have a hard time getting in front because of the bombs that happen to be placed there. So for that reason, our overall goal with our priorities was to never have a bombardment phase where Admiral Goran was down below on the main platform with more than 30 Fury. So to do this, because each of the bosses can only go up one time, we essentially focused on one of the non-Admiral bosses first. It doesn't really matter. So you want to cleave them all down evenly, but remember that the first boss to go up is just the lowest health at the time, first boss to go to Dreadnaught. So, for example, we would cleave them all down, but make sure that Sorka was the lowest health for the first Dreadnaught phase. That way she went up top first time. The reason for this is that the Fury level is not going to be above 30 by the time the first Dreadnaught phase ends. It will be below that. And since Penetrating Thought is gained at 30 Fury, that was not an issue for the first Dreadnaught phase. Then for the second Dreadnaught phase, we make sure that Admiral himself goes up. So again, we cleave them all down after the first Dreadnaught. Then for the second one, we make sure Admiral is the lowest health so that he goes up. And then for the third Dreadnaught phase, we actually try to push the bosses so that they will transition below that 20% health, going into the Iron Will phase before the third Dreadnaught begins. So we only have to deal with 2 Dreadnaught phases. Now, if your DPS is significantly lower, you do have to deal with all 3 Dreadnaught phases. Then you'll have to plan how to deal with Penetrating Shot. Now, if your DPS is lower than ours, and you cannot skip that third phase, and therefore you will have to deal with the Penetrating Shot during one of the bombardments, probably the best thing you can do is, again, make sure Admiral goes up second or third, so you only have to deal with it 1 out of the 3 phases. But during that particular bombardment, try to utilize Hand of Protection from Paladins on the penetrating targets during that phase. So you would want that person with penetrating to run off to one area of the room by themselves. So probably best would be opposite the position that you're using for Blood Ritual. So I don't have footage of this because we didn't use that strategy, but you would essentially have a marker that's on the opposite side of the green and purple, so that you can ensure that no ranged players have to be on that side, no melee have to be over there. The penetrating person runs over there, gets a hand of protection, and then they're safe from the actual shot. And you can also rely on luck somewhat. If the people that get targeted during that bombardment phase are able to drop threat, they can just get rid of it on their own, or use personal cooldowns, of course. So that's one possibility if you cannot skip the third Dreadnaught phase entirely. So the final thing to decide is your overall kill order. Once you push the bosses to their low percent, they start going crazy and gaining iron will stacks. Which do you kill first and then second and so on? So there are really two possibilities in my opinion. You can start with Admiral and then go to Marak and then finally Sorka, or you can start with Marak, then Admiral, and then Sorka. Regardless, Sorka should be last because her abilities are generally going to be the weakest, even when she gains stacks of iron will. We chose to do Admiral first because the overall goal was to reduce the number of turrets that we had to deal with through the phase. Because the more turrets that you have to kill, the more DPS you're devoting to them, and the longer the phase will be in general. So we chose to do Admiral first for this reason. That said, there is a definite argument to be made for killing Marak first because his primary Sanguine Strikes ability at this last phase is going to do the most damage to the raid, and it's unavoidable damage. So you could opt to kill Marak first while ensuring that your range quickly bursts down each turret as they spawn. If you can kill the turrets quickly, then Admiral himself is not super annoying in the final phase. So either of those will work as the first and then second target, just making sure Sorka is the last. So I believe that covers it really for the raid guide for Normal and Heroic Iron Maidens. It's a pretty crazy fight, a lot going on, but as always, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Good grief, too much talking. No one wants to hear this. Unless you do, in which case, I guess you could subscribe. That'd be cool. I don't know why you would, though.